Good evening, I'm Nima, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, May 18th. It's been a year of reckoning for the country since the discovery of 215 suspected unmarked graves at the site of a former residential school in BC. A First Nation found them by using ground-penetrating radar at the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. 73-year-old Percy Casper spent 10 years there as a child and has spent the rest of the year grieving for lost classmates and for himself. Indigenous law expert Nicole Shabas says the discoveries of unmarked graves have resulted in many school survivors pursuing a deeper sense of healing. Meanwhile, the Saddle Lake Cree First Nation in eastern Alberta is researching the deaths of at least 200 children who never came home from the Blue Quills residential school. The community has found remains in unmarked graves, and it wants the federal government to provide funding for mental health supports and equipment to investigate further. All right, switching gears here to this morning's inflation report for April, which won't be much of a surprise to anyone who has been shopping for groceries lately. Statistics Canada reports rising prices for almost everything that goes into your shopping cart pushed the annual inflation rate up to 6.8% last month. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is making food products that contain wheat more expensive. This with prices for bread up 12.2% and pasta prices up 19.6%. Gas prices shot up 36.3% year over year. Turning to the housing market now, where a wave of buyer's remorse is taking shape in several heated real estate markets. This comes after housing prices started dropping and the number of sales slowed over the last 2 months. The Canadian Real Estate Association said earlier this week that the country experienced a 25.7% drop in the number of homes sold over the last year and a 3.8% slide in housing prices between March and April. The average home price last month totaled $741,517. Foreign Minister Mélanie Joly is in New York for 2 days of meetings at the UN on the world food crisis sparked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. She will meet UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres for talks, and she'll take part in a United Nations Security Council open debate on the link between the conflict and food security. Minister Joly says Canada, one of the world's biggest wheat exporters, is determined to work with its allies to help build future food security. Some more bad news for Manitoba communities already dealing with flooding. The province says a weather system moving over southern and central areas of Manitoba could bring as much as 80 millimeters of rain and snow mix to some areas in the coming days. An overland flood warning has been issued for much of western and southwestern Manitoba, including the Parkland region. As of yesterday afternoon, 39 municipalities and at least 4 First Nations had declared states of emergency. The Public Service Alliance of Canada has reached an impasse in contract talks with the federal government and plans to file for conciliation. The union represents more than 120,000 federal public service workers. It says Ottawa isn't offering an increase that protects workers from surging inflation. It also wants the government to address systemic racism and improve workplaces with more remote work options and the rights to disconnect. There's been some trouble along the campaign trail for Conservative Party leadership candidate Pierre Poilievre. Conservative finance critic Ed Fast says he is deeply disturbed that Mr. Poilievre would interfere with the Bank of Canada's independence. During last weekend's leadership debate, Mr. Poilievre said he would fire the central bank's governor over the country's record-high inflation rate. Mr. Fast is co-chair of rival leadership candidate Jean Charest's campaign, and he says the comments hurt the party's credibility on economic issues. Prince Charles was invested as an extraordinary commander in the Order of Military Merit. The prince laid a wreath at the National War Memorial as he began the second day of his Platinum Jubilee Tour of Canada. Ian McCowan, Secretary to the Governor-General, presented the military award to Prince Charles. He said he has been there for Canadian forces at the most important times, including visiting troops in Afghanistan. Prince Charles and Camilla observed a minute of silence before laying a wreath and a bouquet of flowers on the tomb of the unknown soldier. All right, well, the Battle of Alberta opens tonight as the Calgary Flames host the Edmonton Oilers in Game 1 of their second-round NHL playoff series. It is the first time in 31 years the two teams are meeting in the postseason. Oilers forward Derek Ryan says the Battle of Alberta is another level in the regular season. Stay tuned, we'll be right back. A new study published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal looks into what led to some hospitalized COVID-19 patients being readmitted within a month of their discharge. Co-author Dr. Finlay McAllister of the University of Alberta says returning patients tend to be male, older, and have multiple comorbidities and previous hospital visits and admissions. He says a scoring system used by hospitals to predict readmission was more accurate when it included a patient's sex and socioeconomic background. Well, joining us now to give us more insight into the study is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Appletree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Pleasure to be here.
So tell us a little bit more about this study and how it was conducted.
Right. So before this study, really, we didn't have too much information on the number of readmissions after a COVID-19 hospitalization. It wasn't also known how we could compare these readmissions from hospital to hospital or even region to region in Canada. So the researchers basically were looking to determine that frequency and predictors of death or unplanned readmission after a COVID-19 hospital discharge. So the research was published at the CMAJ. It looked at about 46,000 adults hospitalized for COVID-19 in both Alberta and Ontario during the first part of the pandemic. About 18%, which is 8,500 patients, tragically died in hospital between January 2020 and October 2021, which was higher than the norm for other respiratory tract infections. Among those who were sent home, about 9%, or 2,800 patients, returned to hospital within 30 days of leaving, while 2% unfortunately died. And these deaths include patients who returned to hospital.
Now, I understand age being a factor in readmissions in hospitals, but the study highlighted gender also being a factor. So can you tell us a little bit more about what role gender and age played in this study?
That's right. So people who died or were readmitted were older and had a higher Charlson comorbidity burden, and were more likely to be male and more likely to be given discharge home with home care or to a long-term care facility. So what that means is the Charlton comorbidity burden is basically a list of conditions that we know can cause significant burden to the patient. These conditions include HIV, cancer, diabetes, liver disease, stroke, dementia, and congestive heart failure. We know very well but these burdens, there is an age relation to them, but also a gender relation to them. So no surprise that what we were seeing were older people and people who were male.
And the study also highlighted socioeconomic factors that also contributed to a patient's likeliness of readmission from COVID. So can you tell us a little bit more about these socioeconomic factors as well?
Right. So it comes back to this message we're seeing over and over with COVID, that socioeconomic factors seems to be much more important for COVID than other medical conditions, in fact. So when we look at studies like this, we look at socioeconomic status. In Alberta, they call it the Pampelon Deprivation Index. In Ontario, it's the Marginalization Index. And basically looking at these factors, we look at things like postal codes, neighborhoods, and things like that, that really can shape socioeconomic factors. And in these studies, it shows exactly the same thing, that these patients with certain postal codes or certain socioeconomic status certainly predict worse outcomes with COVID-19.
Now, there are some unknown factors in this study, as you mentioned earlier in this interview, but this research was conducted in Alberta and Ontario. So what does this say about readmission rates for the rest of Canada?
Right. So the combined rate of readmission or death was similar, 9.9% in Alberta and 10.6% in Ontario. So there's this question of whether patients were maybe discharged too soon or was care different at all. And what those numbers show us is that there's no real association between length of stay, hospital readmission rates, and areas. So it looks like clinicians were really identifying the right patients to send home, regardless of the region. And all in all, both Alberta and Ontario were similar. So we can broadly assume that we're likely to see similar numbers across Canada. A bit of a generalization, but yes, probably a decent estimation.
All right, Dr. Raut, about 45 seconds left here, but we also know vaccinations played a huge role in reducing hospital rates. So can you tell us a little bit more about how the study mentioned vaccinations?
Yes, it did provide some important insight on the power of vaccines. Of all the patients admitted with COVID-19 in both provinces, 91% in Alberta and 95% in Ontario were unvaccinated. So going back to the efficacy of Moderna and Pfizer in keeping people out of hospital.
Dr. Raut, always great having you on Forum Daily. We'll see you again next week.
Thanks so much for having me.
Stay with us. Coming up after the break, we'll be taking a moment to reflect on the impacts of the residential school system in Canada amid the anniversary of what is referred to by some as the Kamloops 215. We'll be speaking with Mr. Bruce Allan from the Indian Residential School Survivors Society to discuss intergenerational effects from the residential school system. Stay with us. On the anniversary of the tragic Kamloops 215 discovery, we want to address the long-term impacts for residential school survivors and their families. It's been a year of reckoning for the country since a First Nation announced ground-penetrating radar had located 215 suspected unmarked grave sites at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School in BC. And it's estimated that 150,000 First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children attended residential schools, which were part of Canada from 1831 to 1996. Mr. Bruce Allan was one of the students who attended Lejack Residential School near Fraser Lake, BC. He is also an intergenerational survivor through his grandmother and father, who attended Lejack as well. He currently works as a resolution health support worker at the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. Mr. Allan joins us now. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Good afternoon.
Now, some have said the discovery of these graves have led to survivors pursuing a deeper sense of healing. So what does that look like for you and your community, sir?
For me, it was the survivors who didn't participate in the initial compensation processes of that started in 2005 or 6 and continued on till 2013. A lot of survivors didn't participate in that, and when Kamloops happened, they were reminded how bad their experiences were, and they had to start talking about it. So on the ground right away, survivors are, though they've never talked about it before, are starting to share their horrific stories, and just generally the survivors are telling their truths. Those truths have to do with how the school has affected their lives. Even today, their children and their grandchildren are affected by their own experiences, and some of them are just sharing those experiences for the first time. And so that's the healing part, I believe, is because they've never told anyone.
Hearing these stories, it's incredibly heartbreaking. In this segment, we really wanted to highlight the long-term impacts of the residential school system, sir. So we know you were at Lejack Residential School for 7 years. How has your own personal experience shaped your life up until now?
Well, I would say it started with a therapist, an Indigenous therapist, talking to me about residential schools and put me on the path of healing, where I was able to not only work with survivors, but also to bring them out to a place of healing, which means that I had to also make that journey myself. And it's a long healing journey, and it continues today. And many of our survivors are on that same path. So I participated with elders, with therapists, counselors, workshops, conferences, culture camps, elders gatherings, and so all of these things contributed to healing. And I think when we continue to do that and tell our stories, a lot of our people will begin their healing again. And the Kamloops 215, the unmarked graves, really emphasize that we need to continue to work hard in our communities to heal those effects that are still happening today. And that shows up as overdoses that are happening in our communities with our young people, the suicides, the drug and alcohol deaths that are happening. And so we're still reeling from the effects of the residential school today. And so I'm doing my best. I did work on myself, so I'm doing my best to help out those survivors when they come to me.
A long journey ahead for many survivors, sir. A quick 30 seconds left in this interview. If you have any last messages for our viewers on this anniversary, what would it be?
I think as Canadians, we need to educate ourselves, learn more about what the residential schools were all about, as well as the Indian day schools. There's a deadline coming up pretty quick here, but yeah, just learning about the history and listen to the survivors tell their stories, find survivor stories to see what had actually happened in this country.
Mr. Allan, thank you again for joining us today and sharing your story with our viewers.
You're welcome.
Stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break on Forum Daily. Finland and Sweden have officially submitted their applications to join NATO. This move is seen as one of the biggest geopolitical ramifications of Russia's war on Ukraine. Experts say it will also rewrite Europe's security map. NATO envoys have failed to reach a consensus about whether to start membership talks, but meetings will continue in the coming days. Turkey's president has expressed reservations about Finland and Sweden joining, but Canada expects to ratify the accession protocol in just a few days. Meanwhile, the European Union is urging member countries to quickly replenish their depleted stocks of ammunition and military equipment. Many of the EU's 27 member countries have sent equipment to help Ukrainian troops since Russia invaded. At first, it was mostly ammunition, but it now includes portable missiles to destroy warplanes and tanks, as well as heavier equipment. The EU Commission is offering a fund of $526 million over 2 years to countries willing to work in groups of at least 3 to replenish their stocks. All of this comes as a 21-year-old Russian soldier has pleaded guilty to killing a Ukrainian man in the early days of the invasion. Sergeant Vadim Shaishimarin's trial marks the first war crimes trial of the conflict. He now faces up to life in prison. This for shooting the man in the head through an open car window in a village in the northeastern Sumy region. Back to the European Union. Its executive arm is moving to jumpstart plans for the EU to abandon Russian energy amid the Kremlin's war in Ukraine. The European Commission proposed a nearly €300 billion package on Wednesday, which includes more efficient use of fuels and faster deployment of renewable power. Russia is the EU's main supplier of oil, natural gas, and coal. The investment initiative is meant to help EU countries start weaning themselves off Russian fossil fuels this year. The goal is to deprive Russia of tens of billions in revenue and to strengthen EU climate policies. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says time is running out before we incinerate our only home. He is launching a 5-point plan to jumpstart broader use of renewable energies. The World Meteorological Organization has issued its State of the Climate report, which warns that greenhouse gas concentrations, ocean heat, sea level rise, and ocean acidification all reached record highs last year. The WMO says the impacts of extreme weather have led to deaths and disease, migration, and economic losses in the hundreds of billions of dollars. All right, well, meanwhile, the United Nations is significantly lowering its forecast for global economic growth this year from 4% to 3.1%. In a new report on Wednesday, it says the war in Ukraine has triggered increasing global food and commodity prices, as well as exacerbated inflationary pressures. The mid-2022 forecast says the downgrade in growth prospects is broad-based and includes the world's largest economies, the United States, China, and most significantly, the EU. It warned that the 3.1% forecast faces significant downside risks. Health authorities in Mozambique have declared a polio outbreak. This comes after confirming that a child in the country's northeastern Tete province had been paralyzed by the disease. The case in Mozambique is the second imported case of polio in southern Africa this year and follows a case discovered in Malawi in mid-February. According to a statement issued by the World Health Organization, the case in Mozambique was found in a child who began experiencing signs of paralysis in late March. Sequencing indicates that the case in Mozambique is linked to a strain of polio spread in Pakistan in 2019. Authorities in the southwest German town of Waldorf have ordered cat owners to keep their cats indoors until the end of August. This in order to protect a rare bird during its breeding season. The decree is designed to help save the crested lark, which makes its nest on the ground and therefore is easy prey for feline hunters. The bird's population in Western Europe has declined sharply in recent decades. Hundreds of climbers who have scaled Mount Everest over the past few days have begun to return safely down the mountain. Among them are some who set records on the world's highest peak, including the first Ukrainian woman to scale Mount Everest. Antonina Samoilova says she hopes her achievement would call more attention to the war in her country. Lakpa Sherpa, a 48-year-old Nepali, broke her own record by reaching the summit for the 10th time. This is the most times that any woman has climbed Mount Everest. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.